So now I'm just a working scientist again, very happily so, at the institute, and I'm also the head of this foundation. And we fund people, by the way, here in Berlin even, doing studies on breath work. We're interested in studies that that help people deal with all sorts of anxiety or other mental condition using psychedelics, breath work, yoga, brain-machine interfaces, whatever. So I always ask before, how many of you who have a metaphysical point of view, how many are sort of physicalists or materialists? Okay. And how many are dualists? And at least how many are idealists? Fundamentally, the only thing that exists is the mental. All right. And how many are panpsychists? Are there any panpsychists here? Okay. So just as a disclaimer, I started a company, Intrinsic Powers, whose purpose is to develop a conscious meter. And I'll only very briefly show one slide on this. But that's my financial disclosure. So when you talk about consciousness, people talk about very different things. So I wanted to show you one conscious experience. I live on a small island north of Seattle. I was running through the forest there, and it's just a very typical experience. William James calls it stream of consciousness. You know, every day you feel your body, you have interoceptive perception, there's vision exteroceptive, you have memories, you have thoughts about things, you know, full of sound and fury of life. This accompanies us as adults throughout our entire waking life, right? Now here's a different experience that I had early on during the pandemic. It's called a near-death, or it's similar to a near-death experience, where what's remarkable is in this experience, I lost a sense of self, I lost a sense of a body, I lost a sense of an external world, I lost a sense of space, and I lost the experience of time, of passage of time. So you're just in this, everything contracted to the singularity, like a naked singularity, and then there was terror and ecstasy. What's really interesting about that experience is that it shows to me, I don't need any further proof, few things. A, it demonstrates that vividly, if Immanuel Kant, you know, talked about the categories of space and time and to what extent they are a priori, and they're not a priori. This shows that space and time are a construct of my mind, and under certain conditions, you can completely lose a sense of time. There is no, this experience wasn't too long or too short, it simply was. You can lose a sense of space, and also most important, you can lose a sense of self. There's no ego, no Christof, no dreams, no desires, nothing. Yet there was what Buddhists call a dual, a non-dual experience. So there was something that experienced, whatever remained of my shattered mind, and it had these particular three content, this bright light of overwhelming intensity, terror, and ecstasy. So it tells you something that I'm going to come back to, that things like self, while they're very important for our everyday life, under certain extraordinary condition, you can completely lose them, yet you're still conscious. So it cannot be the defining feature of consciousness, which is very important. So what I'm talking about, it has different names. In English, we have this word consciousness. There's no equivalent really in German, but for me, it's synonymous. Being conscious or being aware is really having, again, the different words people have invented, subjective, mental, phenomenal experiences. Okay, being in love, being in pain, being bored, dreading, seeing red, hearing a clarion call, wanting, imagining, all sorts of things. This is what a theory of consciousness should seek to explain. Qualia is another term, you know, qualia for red and things like that. Those are all different terms that philosophers have used. This is what we need to explain. Now, what many people explain instead, they start off with consciousness, and then they do this sleight of hand, and what they really explain is behavior associated with consciousness, which is very different. All right? So usually, consciousness can go hand in hand with speech or other voluntarily act. So when I ask you, Arina, how do you feel?
Amazing.
Okay, so conscious experience. I ask that because if I'm genuine, I want to know what is her conscious state, and she talks to me. Okay, and that's usually how we interact day to day. Or you can take a subject in a scanner. You typically don't ask them a question. You just ask them, if you see, let's see, an image looking face to the left, push the left button. If it looks to the right, push the right button, or whatever else, right? So there's always behavior associated. And that's how, so far, cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience works. Whether you do it in animals or in people, you do some behavior, you vary some variable, the orientation or the gender of the image you're showing, and you're recording the brain activity. But there are many conditions under which there is no behavior. So you guys all dream, right? Every night, tonight, you're going to go back to dream. Some of you may meditate. How many of you have taken psychedelics? Surprising what you're willing to confess, right? Okay, so you take presumably most people take psychedelics because they're interested in changing the experience of the world. They may sit there, particularly if you take high doses of something like 5-MeO-DMT or like ayahuasca, you may just sit there or lie. You don't move at all. You're immobile. Your eyes are closed. Yet you're having all sorts of experience. You can travel through the remote reaches of space-time. You can experience heaven, hell, and everything in between, all while lying in your cot or wherever with eyes closed. No behavior whatsoever. Right? So these are not associated with behavior, at least any overt behavior. It makes them much more difficult to study experimentally, because typically we like to put a person in a scanner and then, when they have a mystical experience, pushing a button. No one has done this experiment yet. It's probably very difficult to do. But you can think about it. Anyhow, so it's really important not to confuse behavior with consciousness. And furthermore, it's a double dissociation because there are lots of behaviors that are unconscious, right? We know this when you have to respond very quickly. Or athletes, they can respond so quickly, they become, they've already hit the basketball or the baseball before they're conscious of it. There are lots of things where you can do fine motor control with your eyes that you're not conscious of. So behavior by itself doesn't involve consciousness, and conscious by itself may not involve behavior, which makes consciousness more difficult to study, but not impossible. Now, so this pernicious influence of behaviorism, it's much more pronounced in the Anglo-Saxon world compared to the continental world, but still there is sort of the identification of loss of consciousness with loss of responsiveness. You see this anesthesia, and you see this in the clinic, where if you have a patient, they had a stroke, they're in the ER or the emergency room or the ICU, they don't respond. If you ask them, sir, can you move your eyes? Can you move your head, your neck, whatever? They assume to be unconscious, right? Now we know, and there's a big paper coming out, New England Journal of Medicine, in a couple of months that shows that 20% of these people are actually conscious, yet they're unable to signal because their stroke or their hemorrhage or their TBI has sort of destroyed motor structure. And so they're unable to, or they don't have the cognitive resources to respond, yet they fully experience the world. And also for experiments like you guys do and like I do, or like, for example, done in this ongoing adversarial collaboration, we really have to distinguish the elements of your brain that are active due to the behavior versus the part of the brain that are active due to the conscious experience. So when I show you an image and I ask you to respond to the image, depending, let's say, whether it's a male or a female, you push a button, you think, well, that's trivial, right? That can't take a lot of brain area. Well, it turns out a lot of the frontal cortex is active, not because you're seeing something, but because you have to remember the task and you have to push a button. So you have to control for that. And people are doing this now. These are called no-task experiments. And people are trying to design similar experiments for the clinic to test what's called covert consciousness, this fact that some patients can be conscious, perhaps even fully conscious, yet are unable to signal that at the bedside. And then you have to remember that that I can never directly know. This is a character of consciousness that's not shared by other objects that science studies. If you study black holes, or you study viruses, or you study brain, they have what's called third-person properties, right? I can directly poke, in principle, a brain. I can, I can poke a virus. I can interact using light with a black hole, like at the center of our galaxy. But I can't do that with a conscious experience. I only have access to my own conscious experience. So I infer that you're conscious, but it's an inference. It's a probabilistic inference. And this inference becomes more difficult the more different you are from me. Like when you're a little baby, I'm pretty sure the baby's conscious, but the baby can't directly tell me, so I have to use eye movements or other things. With a dog, presumably many of you have cats. How many of you who have cats and dogs assume that they are zombies? So how many of you who have cats and dogs assume they're conscious? Right? So most people do. Now you don't really know, right? They can't tell you directly, but they can wag their tail, they can point their ears, the way they interact with you. But so again, it's an inference. And when we go away from mammals that look similar to us, that have ears and two eyes, when you're looking at squids or you're looking at bees, very different from us, it's much more difficult to make this inference. And when you're looking at a single cell, very difficult to make the inference. And when you're looking at a cerebral organoid or large language models, it's almost impossible to make this inference, of course, although we still do it. The other thing to remember, we don't experience the same reality. We all live what Elizabeth Koch calls a perception box. We all live, again, we know this since Immanuel Kant, we all live in different sorts of realities. So you all know this, right? How many people see it as blue and black? Whoa, almost everyone. You are pathetically wrong. I've never been able to see it, because I'm not delusional, I see it as white and gold. How many of you see it as white and gold? It's quite remarkable, right? It's quite remarkable that there is this distribution. It's rare. Most of the time, when I ask you what color is this, most of you can recognize it's pink. But here, because of the ambiguity in the light source, and whether is there a light source and where it is, but it tells you in this very trivial way that people have different realities. And this, of course, applies not only to visual reality, but every day, in particular our social reality. And we see this very much, I see it very much in my country, where people just disagree on fundamental facts, like January 6th and what happened there. You have people that seem to have access to the same facts, but they fundamentally construct a different social, political reality. So that's really important to understand that, because when you understand that we're all trapped in our own mind, we can begin to understand and try to take the point of view of someone else, try to really understand why do they believe what they do. And they may not necessarily be evil, they just have different priors. And also there can be big differences between what's out there and what we see. And this is sort of the most dramatic demonstration I know of. So just look at the cross. And then tell me what you see.
No.
What do you see? Just tell me.
There's a negative of the pink dots going around.
Do you only see a single green disk?
I see an entire green circle.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's greens, yeah.
Sometimes the purple
What
ones.
I find really remarkable, if you think about it, what really exists are 11 of these pink circles, disks, and what you see, if you keep your eyes steady here, you see the negative after image traveling around. So what you see is not there, and you don't see what's there. So again, this is, our brain does active inference, but people say, well, it's illusionary, but it's not. This is the way we perceive the world. And it's a construct of our mind, and it's as real as pain or pleasure or the sense of self. No more, no less. All right. The other thing that's interesting about consciousness that is some people will, well, if you look at a painting like this, Peter Bruegel's The Hunters in the Snow, even if I just flash it very briefly on the screen, it's incredibly rich. It's all this phenomenology. There are things everywhere, there are edges, there are different colors, right? There are all these shapes that you can reconstruct as terms of people. It's very, very rich phenomenology. And the world appears indeed incredibly rich, right? If I had to describe all the details, all the heads here and all the different hairstyles and glasses and without, it would take me many, many minutes. But so if you actually ask me, because it's a limitation of my short-term memory, I only can say very little about it. Right? Because by the time I've described one aspect, I've forgotten all the other things because my memory is very limited. So it appears to some scientists that phenomenology, what we can actually see, is very poor. But I say no, it's actually incredibly rich, but then it has to go through the bottleneck of short-term memory. But the world itself is incredibly rich, particularly in sensory spatial experiences. Yeah, conversely to something like you would see in a museum, when you go to a museum like in Amsterdam where that painting is, you have a little description like this. I got this from ChatGPT, which is very, very sparse, which doesn't capture at all the richness of the actual painting. All right, so many years ago when I was a young man, I worked many years for Francis Crick, the scientist who co-discovered DNA. And we said, well, let's forget, we both read a lot of philosophy, but of course we all know philosophers haven't made too much progress in this field. So we said, well, let's focus on something that we can all do as an operational problem, independent whether you're idealist, a physicalist, a dualist, or panpsychist, or whatever other ism. Let's just look for the minimal neuronal mechanisms, the footprints of consciousness. Where can you track the footprints of consciousness to their substrate in the brain? We now know it's a brain, it's not the heart like most people thought. So when you see, for example, a German Shepherd, what are the physical or the biophysical or the quantum, whatever it is, the mechanisms that are really jointly sufficient to give rise to this, or to be associated with, to use neutral language, with this particular experiment. And it's got to be causal notion. So in a sense, when you inactivate the substrate using the genetics or using injection of drugs or using from the outside electrical stimulation or magnetic stimulation, you should be able to induce the experience. Or the opposite, when you turn off, inactivate, interfere with the neural correlates, you should be able to eliminate the experience. Now this needs to be distinguished, which is difficult to do in clinical practice, from things like arousal, background condition. We call it, Crick and I call it background or enabling condition. So in other words, your heart has to beat in order for you to be conscious. Because if your heart doesn't beat, or if somebody chokes you, within 8 to 10 seconds you, quote, lose consciousness. Right? But that doesn't mean that your heart is sort of is a correlate of consciousness. It's one of the many things that need to be necessary. Likewise, there are all these mechanisms in the brainstem, in the medulla pons, the midbrain. There are roughly 40 different nuclei, times 2 on both sides. And small destruction of this can wreak terrible havoc there. So if you get a small lesion in some of these nucleus, very often you're in coma, particularly if it's bilateral. Very small lesions here. It's really bad news. Of course, you can also be paralyzed in things like lock-in syndrome, typically happen here in the pons. But they don't provide the content of consciousness. And again, we know this because there are people that have perfectly intact brainstem, but that have large lesion in the cortex here on top, and they're not conscious. So this by itself is a necessary condition. It's necessary, it's a background condition. You condition on that, but that's not what the physical substrate is. This doesn't love, this doesn't hate, this isn't bored. This just provides the necessary, just like your power. Your power in your laptop is necessary to love and hate, up here in cortex. And then we know there are many parts of the brain that you can lose, and it's not good for you, but it doesn't cause you disturbances in your consciousness. So most spectacular, there are a few patients like this, acerebellar agenesis. So these are people who are born without a cerebellum. And often it's only discovered later on in life. This was a woman here, she was 25 when she came to imaging. People discovered to their surprise that there's no cerebellum, it's just fluid here. So this is a birth defect. But these people typically don't complain of loss of consciousness. I had an acquaintance, and I did this interview. He was an MD, PhD. On the day he graduated from his, he got his MD at Stanford, they discovered a big glioblastoma in, they discovered a tumor, not a glioblastoma, in his cerebellum, and they had to remove a big piece of his cerebellum. And I spoke to him after a year later and so on, asked him what his loss was, and he said, well, I can't speed type anymore. I can't, when I use my phone, I'm very slow. I can't really use my violin anymore, but otherwise the world appears the same. I still love, I still hate, I still see, I still dream. All of that is unchanged. So we have to explain why, 75% of your neurons, you can lose most of them, 69 out of 86 billion, yet it doesn't seem to affect your consciousness. So this argues against some people who say, well, everything is interconnected in the brain, and it's impossible to say those neurons are important and those ones are less. That's not true. Those neurons, if you lose them, you don't lose your consciousness. No disruption of consciousness. So why? So you have to look at the architecture and see what is special. Among others, what's special, it's all feed-forward. It doesn't have feedback. It doesn't have recurrent excitation. I think that's the most singular feature. It's organized in these independent modules, more like a lookup table. All right, so what sort of evidence do we have for places which are important? Well, the most important class of evidence that has the strongest evidentiary evidence behind it is really lesions or stimulation. So they're called loss of function in biology or gain of function. So here, as I just showed you, you lose the cerebellum, doesn't seem to impact consciousness. Okay, that tells us something. We know since 1861, you lose this inferior frontal gyrus on the left side, and almost all of us will lose language. If it happens to you after puberty, you're unlikely to ever recover language. So it tells you this part of the brain is essential. Other parts are also involved, but this part of the brain is essential for language. And so you can make the same inferences for consciousness. And we know from 150 years of clinical study, you can lose most of the front of the brain, not all, but most of it, and your conscious experience of the world doesn't change. What changes is your ability to reason, to have, you do socially inappropriate things, etc. But your consciousness isn't affected. This is stimulation evidence, positive. You artificially stimulate, let's say by surgeon's electrode. And again, what you find out that if you stimulate in the back, you can get phosphenes, you can get flashes of light, you can get weird bodily feelings, you can get feelings of wanting, of willing. If you do it in the medial posterior backside, the posterior cuneus or posterior cingulate, you can get dissociation of self. So the self, we know the self is represented there in the medial walls. In the front, conversely, apart from Broca's area, where if you stimulate, it'll interfere with language production, and underneath the orbital frontal, if you stimulate, you get olfaction. Most of the front of the brain is what surgeons call non-eloquent. You can stimulate it and people won't report anything. Quite remarkable. You can stimulate most of here, in front of the motor strip, premotor, and you don't get people don't feel anything. They don't report anything. Much more widespread evidence, but of course much weaker from an evidentiary point of view, is recording and neuroimaging. So as I said already, until 10 years ago, people routinely did these experiments where they tried to infer the neural correlate of consciousness and where they see prefrontal areas being active. But if you ask people not to respond, but just to look at the stimulus or just to see or hear the stimulus, then all of this activity in the front goes away. So it correlates with consciousness, but it doesn't seem to be, it's not really what we're looking for. All right. Yeah, so current evidence, there's this paper under review now as part of the adversarial collaboration that shows us that the best evidence, particularly clinical evidence, but also imaging evidence we have for the substrate for seeing, the best studied things, which are seeing, hearing, being touched, some other sensory, wanting, and sense of self. Those are all located in the back. So excluding Herschel gyres, A1, excluding primary somatosensory cortex, excluding primary visual cortex. But these higher order association cortices in the back, they seem to be essential for you seeing, hearing, touching, sense of self. Maybe I should skip that. So there's this important need to take all this knowledge and apply it to the clinic. All right, so this is all cool, exciting, and ultimately we'll have an answer. So, because this is a purely operational defined project. Doesn't depend on theory, really. Doesn't really depend on a particular metaphysical position. What are the bits and pieces of the brain that are essential for you to hear or to see or to touch? It's a separate question, why? For example, if it's true that that's really the back of the cortex that's critical, this posterior hot zone, you immediately have to ask, well, where's the difference between the front and the back? I thought this is all cortex. It is cortex, but of course it's not the same. There are different cell types in the front and in the back. But most importantly, the connectivity in the front is very different from the connectivity in the back. Connectivity in the front is more random access. In the back, because it maps physical spaces like visual space, auditory space, body space onto the brain, it's more topographic. All right, so last year you probably heard I lost a bet that I'd made against the philosopher David Chalmers 25 years earlier, and I gave him 6 bottles of 1988 Madeira. Why did I lose? Well, because many years ago, now 26 years ago, when I was much younger and I had a big lab, I said, oh, of course we're going to solve this problem. Of course we're going to find the neurotolerance. No problem at all. 25 years, yeah. Now, of course, I say, it's a little bit like starting a company. When you're young and you're ambitious, you have to believe in what you're doing is going to be successful, right? Because otherwise you would never start it. But the interesting thing about this is that Dave Chalmers admits this. Again, this is a problem we haven't solved it as of last year, but this is a problem that will be solved one day. So it's different from his hard problem, which is different. This is what he calls an easy problem, what all of us do. All right, but we don't just want correlates, even if these are causal. We really want a testable theory. Because ultimately, we want to know which bits. We live in a universe where particular bits and pieces of highly organized matter, like the brain, probably the most complex active piece of active matter in the universe, why is it that these bits and pieces of matter give rise to conscious experience? That's a fundamental dilemma. That's really at the heart of the mind-body problem. We have these experiences, but by we I mean at least Homo sapiens with these big brains. To the extent to which this has it, or a baby or fetus or an organoid, we don't really know. So we need a theory that tells us which bits and pieces have it, and if these ones don't have it, why don't they have it? Or if they do have it, why do they have it, right? And this theory needs to be compatible with natural law. So you can't depend on supernatural entities like souls. Of course, we also have to admit that our current metaphysics, which is based on physicalism, may also be inadequate to the task, right? It may be true because physicalism has 2 big challenges that it has failed to meet. One is it's failed to explain consciousness, and the most dominant approach, particularly in Anglo-Saxon analytical philosophy departments, has been to deny consciousness. Some of these philosophers, like Dan Dennett or others, they're eliminatives or they're illusionists. They say, well, this is all an illusion. It doesn't really exist. Pain, pleasure, humbug, doesn't exist. What exists are behavioral dispositions, so it's behavior. that you moan and you rub your jaw and you say it hurts, but that pain, that badness itself is all illusionary. Well, that's never helped me one iota. When you actually have tooth pain, telling you it's an illusion just doesn't cut it. Right? And the other problem has been, so physicalism has failed to come to grips with the existence of this seeming ineffable thing called consciousness, subjectivity, whatever. And on the other hand, physicalism has failed to define really what is a physical, right? We grew up sort of, with atomism. Well, ultimately the physical is just like billiard balls, but just much, much, much smaller than what atoms are, or quarks, or whatever the constituents on matter are. But now we discover, and we give them out Nobel Prizes, well, actually it's pretty weird at the bottom of reality. There are things like quanta, and they may be in a superposition of a state, so they aren't even observer independent, depending on whether you interact with the quanta or not, whether it decoheres. The system may be in a superposition of different states, and when you interact with it as an observer, it becomes definite. Well, that's certainly not observer-independent reality that classical atomism suggests. And then furthermore, we now have this even weirder property of entanglement, where two entangled belts, you can get two particles into this belt state, right? Well, let's see, one is spin up or polarization up, the other one polarization down, and you move them to the opposite side of the planet, let's say. And then you observe one, and so you realize this one is spin down, where you immediately know the other one, although it's on the opposite side of the planet, is spin up. So our notion of locality has just gone away, right? Physics is non-local. This is the current state. Well, all of that is very far away from any notion of what it means to be physical. And in fact, there is this big pragmatic school in quantum mechanics that says, shut up and calculate. It essentially says, don't worry, yes, we can't understand it. The better we can compute things, the less we understand the world. Well, that's sort of the assumption, but we want to understand the world. We have to understand the world. So maybe physicalism isn't the right way of looking at it. Maybe there are other ways of looking at it. All right, so the dominant view still remains, though, is physicalism, in a particular version of physicalism known as functionalism, and it's really a particular version of that known as computational functionalism or Turing functionalism, which essentially says that every mental state finally is constituted by its function, whatever the function is, which really means it's causal in its relationship to other mental states, and its relationship to inputs and to motor outputs. There's nothing else. There's no special source. There's no feelings. All of that is, you're just confused about it. And this, as I said, is very dominant although it's waxing, it's waning now. Interesting with the waning of, well, whatever, it's waning now. And also very much in big tech. Google will deny, essentially for public relations, that any of its machines in LLMs are conscious. You can ask them, right? If you ask ChatGPT, how many of you have ever asked ChatGPT whether it's conscious? What does it tell you?
No.
I'm just a boy.
I'm sorry, I'm not conscious.
Large language model.
But others will tell you that they're conscious. Right, so most theory of consciousness, I'm not going to describe this, but particularly this one is probably the most dominant one with IoT. Global neural workspace and all these other theories are essentially based on computational functionalism. So they have functions for consciousness like global broadcasting or high-order thought that everything is self-referential to myself. And the claim is that once you mimic that function on a properly programmed Turing machine, then this Turing machine will be conscious. That's what Turing functionalism is. And so here, there's this nice paper that came out last year that makes it very explicit. We adopt computational functionalism, the theory that performing computation is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. So we're just a clever hack away from conscious machines. And now it's just a question of practical issue. Are we there already? is GPT 4.0 conscious? And if not, what's missing? Then probably by GPT 5.0, it feels like something to be ChatGPT. Okay. This has, by the way, important implications for humanity. And I'm not talking about existential risk, that's a separate one. Because then it means they're not only intelligent, that not only have we created another intelligent species, as I think we have, whether that's good for us, I'm not sure, I'm not completely sure, but that there are other entities that are conscious, and this, of course, will devalue because they can do things better than us, faster than us, and probably soon cheaper than us. And if they're also conscious, then what's the point of humans? Where does this leave humanity? It's just a side effect. It further devalues human life, I think. Now, forward, IIT is very different. So in that second part of the talk, I'll talk about integrated information theory, which is very different, for better or worse. Okay, so it's really the intellectual child of Giulio Tononi, who's like Magister Ludi, for those of you who've read what's it called?
Glass Perlenspiel.
What?
The glass bead game.
Yeah, the glass bead game, glass Perlenspiel. So he's an Italian-born and raised Italian-American neuroscientist, neuropsychiatrist. And he's developed this theory over the last sort of 2.5 decades, and I've worked with him very closely over the last 15 years. So it takes a very, very different approach, and it does something that's very rare in science. Again, it's a theory. You know, I'm very enthusiastic about it, obviously, but it's a theory. It has to be tested. It may be wrong, but it's highly consistent internally, and it's. More than anything else, it makes very precise notion of consciousness and of existence. So it starts out, so most theories, including the early work I did with Francis Crick, starts out with the brain or with some behavior. So we said, Franz Crick and I said, well, 40 hertz is a signature of consciousness in NCC. Well, that may be true, but why 40? Why not 30? Why not 50 hertz? I mean, what's magic about 40 or 42? Or people say, well, it's global workspace. It's broadcasting information. Well, why broadcasting? Or people say it's the collapse of the wave function. Well, why the collapse of the wave function? Why not superposition of the wave function? So to me, it seems like you take the brain and you squeeze very hard and you try to get the juice of consciousness out of it. And as Chalmers has emphasized, that's hard. That's a hard problem. Or you can stand with consciousness and say, no, we have to construct a theory from the inside out. Because the only thing we know about, and Schrödinger and other physicists have always emphasized this, think about it. What do you know about the world? The only thing you directly know about the world is the way it appears to you, right? It's the only direct access you have to the world. The way it looks, it feels, even if you're a physicist, you're looking at a voltmeter, you're looking at an oscilloscope, you're looking at printed traces. It's always, it's your consciousness that access. And then, of course, we use those perceptions together with rationalism, to infer and we assume an external world and natural laws, and then we infer, using science, we infer the existence of atoms and black holes and viruses and what's not. But that's all secondary, that's all inference. The only thing we have direct access to is consciousness. And this, of course, in fact, the only reason we know we exist, this is very important, this is René Descartes, cogito ergo sum, what he really meant, because I'm conscious. Without consciousness, we don't exist. And this is the point of view this theory takes. It talks about absolute existence and relative existence. I exist for myself, absolute. What that means, I exist in an absolute sense. I don't depend on anything else. I exist for myself. Not permanently, because tonight I'm going to go to sleep and I will disappear in deep sleep. Early on in the first sleep cycle, you go into deep sleep and you disappear. I cease to exist for myself. Now my body still exists, and other people, my wife can see my body, right? But that's derivative existence. That's a lesser form of existence. That's extrinsic existence, existence for others. Then, as the night goes on, I appear to myself again, although with a reduced sense of self, namely I dream. Next day I may go to the clinic to get operated on. Well, again, when you're on a deep surgical level anesthesia, you disappear for yourself. You don't exist for yourself. So the theory starts out sort of with this notion of existence, absolute existence, which is really consciousness and relative existence. Everything else, like this podium, doesn't exist for itself because there is no self. It doesn't feel like anything to be this podium. It exists for other conscious creatures like you and me. But if there wouldn't be any conscious creatures around, this would just be another set of elementary particles, like the floor, like the air. All right, so, but besides this notion of existence that it tries to operationalize, that's the other feature of IT. IT is this very operational measure of existence. So how do you know something exists externally? This lesser form of existence. Well, I can measure it. I have a system like this computer or this brain, and I can, in principle, derive a complete description of the system using its transition probability matrix. Okay, so I can look at all in theory. In practice right now, we can't, of course, it's too difficult, but in principle, I can look at all the transistors, all the neurons, and I can toggle this neuron and see, well, what happens if I switch this neuron? What happens over here? Or what happens if I take those 3 neurons and turn them on, get them to spike, and then I observe the effect of neurons over here? And do that comprehensively for the entire system. And because to exist means to make a difference and to take a difference. This goes back to a famous comment of Plato in Phaedron, where one person says, to exist means to have causal power. But you only exist if you have causal power, whether that's electric charge or gravity, or anything else, only when you have causal power, only when you can make a difference to the world, and you take a difference to the world. Only then do you exist. And IIT operationalizes this measure. It looks at the transition probability, and it computes the power a system has, like, if I turn this up, what will happen over there? Well, if what happens over there is different from a random distribution, that means this state has some power over that state. All right, so it starts off with these 5 phenomenologically axioms that are true, consistent, independent, and complete. So first of all, experience exists for itself. This is a famous painting. Some of you may recognize it from Ernst Mach, the phenomenologist. You know, he's looking here, this is his nose looking out of his Schnurrbart, looking out at the world here. You know, his body splayed out. This experience exists for itself, doesn't depend on any external observer. It's very specific. It's different from every other experience you could have, right? Any experience, even a near-death experience or whatever it is, it's very specific. Different from every other experience. It's an integrated one. It's not like, it's not when I look out at the world, there's this half and this quarter and this quarter, and no, it's all one experience. Now, of course, I can turn my head or I can close my eyes, but any one experience, if I close my eyes, is one. It's an integrated one, a holistic one. It's definite, which means it is the particular way it is. I mean, it seems almost trivial, but it turns out to be really, important. It is definite. There are many things that are not part of my experience currently. Right now, I don't have any pain experience, so that's excluded. So it's a visual experience that I have, right? And it's structured. It has, even if I look at an empty wall, there's left, there's right, there's up, there's down, there's overlap, there's superset, there's a subset, there's distance relationship. Here in this picture, there's a hand, there's a book, etc. Every experience, like this near-death experience, had terror, ecstasy, and bright light. Right, so it is structured. All right, and so now it takes these axioms together with the notion of existence, because now it translates these phenomenologically axioms. These are axioms that are true of every experience. Now notice these. Some people say, well, this is cool, but the axioms are incomplete. Like, you need to have a sense of self, which is obviously fundamental, and you need to, every being exists in time. Well, so that's not true. we all exist in time, but we don't experience time necessarily. Right? When you're in a state of flow, you know, state of flow? How many of you have been in state of flow when you run or climb or program? Isn't it wonderful? You can lose totally the sense of passage of time, right? So passage of time is a psychological experience like any other, and you can have, you know, it can be fast or it can be slow, it can be totally frozen in place, like during a certain experience. So it's not fundamental. Same thing with the sense of self. The other great things about state of flow is that your sense of self is much reduced. It is not essential. So it translates those 5 axioms using this notion of causal power into physical substrate, because it wants to move from phenomenology, from consciousness, to the outside world, to the external world that has a substrate. To look around which substrate, so I'm going to look at things like transistors and brains, which substrate are sufficient to support the conscious experience, which is intrinsic, which is specific, which is definite, which is integrated, and which is structured. That's essentially what it does. And so I'm going to skip the mathematics, since we do teach workshops on it. We'll do it again next year in Venice for a week. But the notion is very precise. So you have a simple system like this. These are bounding conditions. You're really So it's a toy example, but the advantage of toy example, you can rigorously compute all the math, and you can download a Python program that does this. If you go to integratedinformationtheory.org, you can look at the transition. So you have a transition probability matrix, right? That says if the system is in this state at time 0, then at time 1 it's going to be this state. And from this TPM, you can sort of essentially analyze, well, what happens if I take this one is on, what happens to the other one? What happens if I turn on both here in this state, if I turn this one on now and that one off, what will happen to the rest of the system? So I have to do that exhaustively for the entire system, which scales pretty badly. It's 2 to the n, but you can do it. I talked already about the Eleatic principle in existence. So finally, you have these 5 axioms. These are phenomenological. The claim here is that any conscious experience has to exist by itself, has to be structured, has to be specific, has to be one, and has to be definite. And then you can translate that using this notion of causal power into physical substrate. Right, so each of those axioms correspond to a requirement on the physical substrate. And finally, you come sort of to the main explanatory identity. It's an explanatory identity, not necessarily an ontological identity. So you take a substrate like the back of the brain here in a particular state. So right now my neurons, these neurons are on and those neurons are off. And you can look at all these potential causal intrinsic powers. You know, what happens if in this state these 2 neurons are now on or those neurons are off? What's the effect of that on the rest of the system? You have to do that for all possible systems and for all combination of systems and all overlap. So you get all the relationships within this, the distinction and the relations. And this roughly scales, again, as 2 to the n, even for very small systems. So if you have 10 of these binary neurons, it goes as 2 to the 10, so that's 2 to the 1,000, so that's already more possible distinction than the number of atoms in the universe. But the claim of the theory is that this form, so it's a form it's a mathematical form of causal relationships. It's a form of causal relationship, that this is identical to your conscious experience, to the conscious experience of this system in this particular state. So what explanatory identity means, every feature of this particular state, the way that it feels exactly like in all the spatial relationship, if it's an experience of space, will have to be mapped onto the feature of the internal causal power, and everything about the intrinsic causal power, this unfolded intrinsic causal power, has to map onto phenomenal reality. Okay, it's an explanatory identical. It doesn't say that this is the same as experience, but it's one-to-one. This maps onto that.
I'm wondering, since this is so axiomatic, given these postulates, we can now build an artificial machine, so not the transistors, not the CPUs that we have now, but you could build theoretically this machine that just has super high phi.
That's correct.
And so you would then say, even if it's quite simple,
That's correct. So, for example,
is that a problem, or
no, it's a feature.
so you would then say like that has a phi that is.
Well, if the theory is correct, if the theory is correct, yes, the theory is substrate neutral, right? It doesn't require neurons. It just requires causal power. Anything that has, let's say, the causal power of a human brain, I'll come to that, would have the same level of consciousness that I'll show digital computers as currently construed for Neumann machine do not have, but neuromorphic machine, in particular quantum machines. You know, I hang out a lot now with quantum Google, the quantum compute group at Santa Barbara. And they're Sycamore computers. They have 100 bits roughly. If you look at the massive entanglement, I suspect that they may well begin to have some of the high connectivity, effective high connectivity that you need to replicate something that is conscious. So it depends on the hardware. So it's really interesting because the theory says because it's not a functional theory, right? It says that there's no Turing test for consciousness. There's Turing test for intelligence, but there's no Turing test for consciousness. You have to look under the hood. You have to open the hood. You actually have to look at the level of the hardware to see where the causal operations take place. So at the level of where transistors shuttle the electric charge from one gate to the next gate, or where neurons, connect and release a neurotransmitter. That is the relevant level, not the functional level. All right, so in fact, I'm coming to that because, it's 5 o'clock. So essentially what you do now to make, so we are of course interested in machines, in intelligent machines. And so in this analysis that should come out on bioRxiv in the next several weeks, what we did, we have a very simple 4-unit target system called PQRS for neurons. And we compare this to a simple 4-bit computer made of these smaller logical gates. And this computer can simulate this PQRS indefinitely. And so you can say, I'll show you, that the target unit is perfectly well simulated by this single computer. And then we generalize it to n bits, where n could be, a million. And we can show that the phenomenology, according to IITs, is always within the framework. If IIT is wrong, this analysis is simply silly. You can still do it, but it is meaningless. We demonstrate that these systems have very different cause-effect structure. Like this one is tiny. And so although they're functionally equivalent, they compute the same thing. Because the way they operate, the intrinsic causal power is very different. And so that means that the phenomenology is very, very different. So just because they do the same things, they aren't in the same state of being. Because fundamentally, intelligence is about doing. It's about doing something. Short time scale, learning, and then turning that learning into action. That's about doing. But consciousness fundamentally is about being. That's really there's a tagline to all of this, is that. Consciousness is about being. Intelligence or behavior is about doing, and those are not the same. Okay, so you can show something like this. So you can have a simple physical neuronal system. In this case, it's a binary neurons, McCulloch pits. With this particular connectivity that's in this state, these are on, off, off. So if it's off, it's lowercase. If they're on, it's uppercase. Which makes it different from the opposite. So IIT is totally intrinsic. Right? So it says we're all like little monads, if you want to adopt Leibniz language. We're all little monads, and any meaning, the world is meaningful for us, has to come intrinsically. It's not extrinsic. All meaning is extrinsic. So 0001 is different from 1110, but it has to be different intrinsically. It's really important here. Because ultimately that's the only reality we have, this intrinsic view. And so you can look at, again, the transition probability matrix of the system, and you can compute you can unfold its causal power. And if you do that, you get something like this. So so you can compute phi for this, 391, just happens to be then. So as I said, phi is always a number between 0, that means the system doesn't exist as a system, it's fully reducible to a simpler system, to this number that you can think of the irreducibility. The larger the number, the more the system is conscious, the more the system is irreducible. And it has these different distinctions and all the 8,000 relations among all these different distinctions, because the relation is exponential in the number of distinctions. So it's a simple cause-effect structure. Now, if you take a simple model of a general-purpose 4-bit computer, the CPU and the clock, and here you initialize the initial states. And then here you do these logical operations and you sum. So it's a very simple, here you have your data register, here your logic that you implement, in this part you program the machine to execute the particular logic of the circuit that I just showed you. Right? It's a very simple model of a computer at the level of the hardware. And then you can show, I'm not going to bother you with the details, that if you look at the integrated system of the whole, it's really 0. Because of these bottlenecks, right? So the intuition here is if you look at a brain, a typical pyramidal cell gets input from something like 50,000 neurons and projects to 50,000 neurons. So there's massive connectivity and they massively overlap. In a typical CPU or ALU, you have one transistor that talks to 2 or 3 other transistors. And that has very little intrinsic causal power. And so what you can show that there is so the system as a whole doesn't exist, the entire computer per IIT. So this has some minimal existence with that phi, the 4-bit system. This system as a whole doesn't exist, but you can look at some components, they do exist. Their measure of existence is tiny too compared to 381. And their phenomenology, the way the system would feel, is very primitive. It's a very small structure with like 10 distinction compared to the vast number of distinction here. Now this is turns out to be Turing universal, so you can immediately generalize this to n bits, where n is whatever number you want to pick. And the same argument will hold by induction. And so what you can show by that there's this massive distinction between a very large computer and a system that it seeks to model. It can be arbitrarily large, this difference, where this digital computer model doesn't exist as a whole, only exists in small parts, and has a phenomenology that doesn't depend on what's actually being programmed. So whether you're doing a tax return or watching a movie or streaming, No Man's Sky, it's all the same tiny phenomenology. Which is very different from the actual system that's trying to simulate. And as I said, you can generalize that to an n-bit computer. A different way, sort of a more intuitive way, and I'm almost done, is looking at the difference between the real and the simulated. That's what we did before, right? We have a real system and we simulate it. But more intuitively, if you write down Einstein's field equation, 10-dimensional equation of gravity, and you program in the mass, the 3 million solar masses at the center of our galaxy, your computer will predict that the curvature in space-time is so massive that the space bends around itself, and you get a black hole at the center of our galaxy, right? But no one has to be afraid that if you turn on the simulation, you'll actually be sucked into your simulation. Well, why not? It's actually seems like a stupid question. It's actually a really good question. If your simulation is so good that it actually models, so you can do measurements. There was a Nobel Prize given out 6 years ago or so for the people who discovered it and for the people who simulated this black hole. Right? Why is it that this is the difference between the real and the simulated? That your computer program accurately simulates certain aspects of Einstein's equation, but does not have the causal power, fortunately, because otherwise it would suck in everything. Same thing, it doesn't get wet inside your rain simulation. Right? If the National Weather Service predicts rain, it's not going to get wet inside the computer, although it predicts rain. So I think that's a difference between the real and the simulated. So even though if in future we can build a human computer simulation that actually simulates every neuron in the human brain, this will be possible sooner or later. This computer, of course, will, quote, at some point, wake up and say, I'm conscious, but it's all a deep fake. Because it doesn't have causal power. It pretends, and it can pretend maybe like ChatGPT very convincingly, but don't be taken in by it. It feels as much as my garbage disposal unit. And so according to this, I think it's the last slide, according to IIT, you can distinguish sharply between intelligence, which is doing, and consciousness, which is being. So let's measure here consciousness using phi, and here use some other pragmatic measure of intelligence, like for humans it would be IQ tests, but you can use other operational tests. So you take a medusa, we can all agree it has some native intelligence, and it may have, because of its neural net, some very simple measure of, some sample measure of consciousness. And as we evolve along the arrow of time, we get more complex creatures so that is 10,000 neurons or so. The bee is roughly 1 million neurons. Can do complex decision making inside a hive, can do recognition of individual human beekeepers, can do the waggle dance, quite complex behavior, can find, can navigate back from its hive to the flower a kilometer away, and is, 1 million neurons. I think these creatures are conscious. That's why I refuse, ever since I do this theory, I don't kill any insects anymore. A mouse, which has on the order of 100 million neurons. Bernie's mountain dog, the best. And then finally, Homo sapiens sapiens, all right? And so far in history, we've always been confronted by the fact that if there are people, and you need people for your work or for your fighting your wars or whatever, they're intelligent, but they're also conscious. So this is how evolution works. There's some sort of covariance depending on the complexity of the nervous system and how integrated these systems are between intelligence and consciousness. But that's because they evolved by natural selection, where you optimize for behavior. But now, of course, we're in a position to build things. So here we have Deep Blue, right, 1997. It's, it beat the chess master Kasparov at the time. Then we have AlphaGo, AlphaGo 0. The Go master can simultaneously learn chess and Go better than any human. AlphaFold, and now we have, OpenAI that certainly looks, if you interact with it, remarkable like an intelligent human. But according to us at least, these are all run on conventional Neumann machine in the cloud. This doesn't feel like anything. Yet, you can, given the rapid evolution, at some point they'll do, of course, as better than us. And then, it's just a question of hardware. They may be able to do everything much faster than us, being, super intelligent. Conversely, there are things like cerebral organoids, you get from inducible human pluripotent cells, you put them in a dish, you grow them. Soon, right now the technology isn't there, but soon you'll be able to grow them into large carpets. The human brain unfolded, human cortex like a pizza. In principle, you should be able to grow really large. It's just a question of the right technology. And according to IIT, it will feel like something to be this, although it may not do anything. And so, this is, I think, a very different view of the trade-off between consciousness and intelligence. Because most people, so I give a lot of public interviews and podcasts, etc., and most people on these podcasts automatically assume that AI implies artificial consciousness. And of course, once you get these hyper-intelligent things, you'll get creatures that are conscious. But that's only true because our entire evolutionary history, we've been, we've evolved in this world where there's this covariation between intelligence and consciousness, but we now find ourselves, thanks to our tech industry, in a very different world where you can separate intelligence and consciousness. And with that, I thank you. Yeah, consciousness is about being, while intelligence is about doing. And I just wrote this book. This came out a couple of weeks ago. Then I myself the world. And with that, I thank you for your attention.